The roar of engines above Europe carried more than just the sound of war. Carried pride, reputation, and sometimes arrogance. German fighter pilots, convinced of their superiority, mocked the idea that an American squadron of African-American aviators, the Tuskegee Airmen, better known by the striking red paint on their tails, could ever measure up against the Luftwaffe. To the Germans, these red tails were little more than a propaganda stunt, a unit they believed lacked both the skill and the discipline to challenge seasoned aces of the Reich. But in the skies, arrogance could prove fatal. The Luftwaffe's veterans remembered their early victories. They had terrorized the skies over Poland, France, and the Balkans. They clashed with Britain's Royal Air Force in the Battle of Britain and faced the Soviet air fleets on the Eastern Front. German flyers saw themselves as the masters of aerial warfare, carrying the tradition of names like Richthofen, the legendary Red Baron. With that history behind them, the idea of being rivaled by American flyers, especially black pilots whom Nazi ideology dismissed outright, was laughable. Yet high above the clouds, where bullets cut through aluminum and survival depended on more than skin color, the measure of a pilot was determined not by prejudice, but by skill, instinct, and sheer determination. The Tuskegee Airmen had already learned to live with doubt. In their own country, they faced discrimination, skepticism, and constant reminders that many believed they didn't belong in the cockpit of a fighter plane. They trained harder, flew longer, and carried on with an intensity forged from having to prove themselves again and again. Each mission wasn't just about surviving, it was about shattering expectations. And then came the skies of Italy. The Allied push into southern Europe created a desperate need for bomber escorts. The Americans were losing B-17s and B-24s at alarming rates to German fighters. To fly a bomber over enemy territory was to step into a death trap without protection. When the Red Tails arrived, they were given a chance, some would call it a test. Escort these bombers, protect them from German interception, and perhaps silence the doubts once and for all. The Germans didn't take them seriously. Reports from Luftwaffe pilots described them as inexperienced, unremarkable, not worth adjusting tactics for. A dangerous underestimation, because once the Red Tails got into the fight, dismissing them would prove costly. The first clashes were brutal. German Messerschmitt Bf 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s streaked toward the bombers, confident that victory would be quick. But instead of scattering or faltering, the Red Tails dove in with ferocity. Their P-51 Mustangs, sleek and fast with those distinctive crimson tails, tore through the formations with precise attacks. German pilots soon realized they weren't chasing an easy kill. They were facing disciplined opponents who knew how to fight. And the record began to grow. One kill, then another. 10, 20, 30. Soon, the tally of German aircraft downed by these supposedly unworthy pilots climbed past 50. By the time the Luftwaffe realized what was happening, the Red Tails had already carved their reputation into the sky. The number that shocked everyone wasn't just the kill count, it was the bomber survival rate. Units escorted by the Red Tails returned home with far fewer losses than when guarded by other fighter groups. To the bomber crews, the sight of red-painted tails weaving through enemy fire was a lifeline. The mockery the Germans began with was slowly replaced by a grudging respect. And yet, in the mess halls and briefing rooms, German flyers still tried to brush them off. They told themselves the victories were exaggerated, that the Americans inflated their claims, that luck favored the underdogs. But every pilot who went up against them knew differently. Behind the bluster, they recognized skill. As the months went on, the Red Tails continued to climb in victories. The count surged to 100 enemy aircraft destroyed. 100 German planes brought down by the very men they dismissed as incapable. Each number on that tally was not just a kill, but a blow to arrogance, to prejudice, and to a system that insisted ability could be measured by skin color. The skies, indifferent to ideology, had revealed the truth. What the Germans once laughed at now haunted their missions. And for the Red Tails, the fight was no longer just about proving they belonged. It was about showing the world that talent, courage, and discipline could not be bound by prejudice. But the story of their 100 victories is not one of numbers alone. Behind every kill lay stories of dogfights that pushed machines to their limits, moments when life and death balanced on a trigger pull, and instances when teamwork meant the difference between returning home or falling from the sky. And so, as the Red Tails etched their legend into history, each mission became a chapter in a tale that reshaped not just the war in the air, but the future of military service itself. The Red Tails' reputation wasn't built overnight. It was forged in the crucible of missions where hesitation meant death and every mistake was punished by fire from above or flak from below. To fly into the heart of Nazi territory was to invite chaos, and yet the Red Tails turned chaos into opportunity. German squadrons expected American escorts to scatter when confronted with swarms of Bf-109s or the dreaded FW-190s. That was the Luftwaffe's tactic. Break apart the defense, pick off stragglers, and tear into the vulnerable bombers. But when German formations collided with the Red Tails, they found no easy gaps. Instead, they ran into disciplined pilots who flew with a unity that unsettled even veteran aces. Every Red Tail understood their mission with crystal clarity. Protect the bombers at all costs. Glory didn't matter. Aces tallies didn't matter. What mattered was that those lumbering bombers dropped their payloads and lived to return. Other groups sometimes chased kills, breaking away from the formations they were assigned to guard. The Red Tails did not. They stayed locked in, covering the bombers like a shield of steel and fire. That discipline created legends. Bomber crews began whispering stories about them. Tales spread of Red Tails chasing off attackers even when outnumbered, of them refusing to abandon a crippled bomber limping home on one engine, of them circling above until the last formation crossed friendly lines. For men sealed inside those flying fortresses, hearing the engines of the Red Tails above brought relief that words could barely describe. But not every mission was a victory without cost. Dogfights in those skies were savage. Picture a Mustang diving through flak bursts, its guns lighting up as tracers rip across the air. A German fighter loops in behind, cannon shells shredding the tail. Another Red Tail spots it, cuts across, and fires. One moment separates triumph from disaster. Many pilots didn't make it back. And yet, even in loss, the group's reputation only grew stronger. Because every time they went up, they fought with the kind of resolve that made even their enemies rethink old assumptions. For German pilots, the shock was unsettling. Some couldn't reconcile how this group, scorned by propaganda, flew with such precision. Reports began to filter back to Luftwaffe commanders. The dismissive laughter that once followed mention of the Red Tails was replaced by silence. No one liked admitting it, but the Red Tails were good, dangerously good. The turning point came during missions deep into enemy territory, when the Luftwaffe threw everything it had left into the skies. Desperation fueled their attacks. They were defending not just strategic targets but the pride of an air force that had once dominated Europe. German aces dove headlong into formations, hoping to break the escorts apart. Instead, they were met by Red Tails who had grown sharper with every mission. Their tactics evolved constantly. They learned to anticipate enemy dives, to counter surprise attacks, to hold formation under the heaviest fire. What began as a unit dismissed as incapable had become a nightmare for any German squadron unfortunate enough to cross their path. The kill count mounted. Each tally was more than a number. It was proof that training, discipline, and courage could outmatch arrogance. By the time the total reached 100, the Luftwaffe could no longer deny it. These pilots, whom they had once ridiculed, were carving a record that stood shoulder to shoulder with the finest fighter groups of the war. Yet for the Red Tails themselves, the victories carried a deeper meaning. They weren't just fighting Nazis in the skies. They were fighting prejudice back home. Every kill, every bomber saved was a message. A message that ability had nothing to do with color, that courage couldn't be confined by bigotry. They knew that when the war ended, their fight would continue on different soil. But in the moment, high above the battlefields of Europe, it was about survival. It was about proving that when the Red Tails flew, the skies belonged to them. And as the war dragged on, their legend spread not only among allies but among enemies. German pilots, once confident and mocking, now went into the air wary of the crimson-tailed Mustangs. Some even admitted privately that if they saw those tails flashing in the sun, they knew they were in for the fight of their lives. The 100 kills were not the end of their story, they were only the foundation. Because every mission after that number became part of something larger. A reckoning in the air, a rewriting of who could be called an ace, who could be called a hero, and who could claim the skies of Europe as their own. Every mission flown by the Red Tails carried a weight that could not be measured in fuel or ammunition alone. It carried the burden of expectation from commanders who doubted them, from bomber crews who prayed for them, and from enemies who sought to erase them from the skies. Each time their Mustangs lifted off from Italian airfields, their crimson tails cutting through the morning haze, the pilots knew they were not just flying into combat. They were flying into history. The skies above Europe were unforgiving. The cold seeped into the bones, frost creeping across cockpit glass as engines screamed against thin air. Clouds offered no comfort. They hid dangers, German fighters that could appear in a blink, flak bursts that shredded formations, and sudden storms that threw aircraft into chaos. For the men of the 332nd, this was the battlefield. There were no trenches to hunker down in, no walls to shield them. Only the fragile skin of aluminum and the unshakable discipline drilled into them. German fighters were predators, and their reputation preceded them. Veterans of campaigns stretching back to the Battle of Britain, these Luftwaffe aces carried names whispered with respect and dread. They had survived countless dogfights, amassed kill tallies that rivaled entire squadrons, and flown through the fire of a dozen fronts. For Allied pilots, meeting them head-on was no small challenge. But the Red Tails were unlike other escort groups. What set them apart wasn't just their skill with the stick and throttle, though that skill was formidable. It was their refusal to abandon the mission. German tactics thrived on sowing confusion. They struck from above, diving at speeds that left little room for reaction. The goal was simple: force the escorts to scatter, leave the bombers exposed, and then tear into the formation like wolves into a herd. Against most groups, this worked. Against the Red Tails, it did not. The discipline of the 332nd was ironclad. When Messerschmitts or Focke-Wulfs broke through the cloud cover, the Red Tails did not break apart chasing kills. They stayed locked in position, weaving patterns that turned chaos into order. If one Mustang peeled off to engage, another slid seamlessly into its place, ensuring no bomber was ever left exposed. German pilots were stunned. For years, they had relied on the arrogance of escorts, young Americans eager to chase a dogfight and rack up a kill tally. But the crimson-tailed Mustangs played a different game. They weren't chasing glory. They were guardians, and that made them harder to beat. Bomber crews noticed. Imagine the scene inside a B-17 thousands of feet in the air. The engines hammer with relentless noise, the fuselage rattles with each gust of wind, and the gunners scan the skies for shapes cutting through the horizon. Anxiety grips every man aboard. You know the German fighters are coming. It's not a question of if, but when. Then, through the narrow view of a turret, you spot them. Dozens of dark specks growing larger, closing fast. Hands tighten on the triggers, breath quickens. And just before fear takes hold, another sight appears. Sleek Mustangs diving from above, red tails glinting in the sun. They cut across the German formation like blades, guns blazing. The bombers live another day. For the men sealed in those metal fortresses, the Red Tails were more than escorts. They were hope with wings. Crews began to spread stories in mess halls and barracks, tales of Red Tails refusing to abandon a crippled bomber limping back over enemy territory, of Mustangs that chased attackers until fuel gauges dropped perilously low, of escorts circling above until every bomber cleared hostile skies. Trust grew quickly. Bomber groups began asking for them by name. "Give us the Red Tails," they'd say, because they knew those crimson flashes in the sky meant survival. The numbers proved it too. Losses dropped significantly when the Red Tails flew. What started as whispers became an undeniable truth. If you wanted to make it home, you wanted the Red Tails above you. But that trust came at a price. The Luftwaffe did not take humiliation lightly. German squadrons threw themselves at the bombers with increasing ferocity, desperate to claw back control. Sometimes the Red Tails were outnumbered 2-1, even 3-1. Still, they did not yield. Accounts from the time speak of ferocious battles where entire German wings tried to smash through, only to be beaten back by fewer escorts who refused to bend. The kill counts mounted. Dogfights left the skies littered with wreckage, black smoke trailing from aircraft plunging into fields and forests below. For the Red Tails, each victory was more than just another tally. It was a declaration that they belonged among the best. By the time their tally reached 100 confirmed kills, the Luftwaffe could no longer laugh them off. To face a Red Tail was to face a pilot who fought with unshakable determination. German reports began to shift. The scorn that once dripped from their words was gone, replaced with a grudging respect. Some Luftwaffe pilots admitted privately that the sight of red tails flashing in the distance meant they were in for a brutal fight. For an air force built on pride, it was a bitter pill to swallow. Yet, the Red Tails' war wasn't fought only in the skies. When they landed, they returned to a segregated base, saluted by commanders who sometimes still doubted them, and lived in a country that questioned their worth. The contradiction was cruel. They risked their lives for freedom abroad, yet could not fully claim it at home. Still, that contradiction fueled them. Every bomber saved, every German fighter downed, was proof written in the sky that courage and skill had nothing to do with color. For the men of the 332nd, flying was more than a mission. It was vindication. Every sortie declared that they were not only equal, they were exceptional. And in the hearts of bomber crews who owed their lives to the Crimson Escorts, there was no question. The Red Tails weren't just another fighter group. They were legends. As the war pushed deeper into 1945, their legend only grew. German forces were dwindling, their resources stretched thin, yet still dangerous. The Red Tails met them head-on, mission after mission, carving their story into the skies of Europe. Each new flight carried the same discipline, the same unity, and the same unbreakable promise. The bombers would not be left unguarded. And in those promises, the Red Tails built something larger than numbers or victories. They built trust. They built respect. They built a legacy that would endure long after the final dogfight faded into memory. The Red Tails had already shaken the Luftwaffe's confidence in ways the German high command struggled to admit. Every mission they flew carved a new mark in the skies, not just with the roar of engines, but with the certainty that their opponents could no longer rely on past assumptions. German pilots, trained to believe the Tuskegee Airmen were inexperienced, now found themselves cornered, ambushed, or flat-out defeated by men whose tactics and focus defied the stereotype. What unsettled the Germans most was not just the skill, but the relentlessness. Many Allied squadrons, after escorting bombers to their designated target, often peeled away once bombs dropped, leaving daylight formations exposed to the deadly swarm of German interceptors. The Red Tails never left. They stuck to their mission like iron to a magnet, even when it meant passing up chances at personal glory. Kill counts weren't their obsession. Keeping those lumbering fortresses and liberators safe was. And yet, while escort duty might sound routine, it became the very thing that turned them into legends. On one of their defining missions, bomber crews flying deep into German heartland looked out from their plexiglass noses and tail guns to see the familiar streak of crimson on the P-51 Mustangs beside them. The Luftwaffe had already been shadowing the formation, waiting for the escorts to disengage. But this time, when the swarming Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs swept in, they ran straight into the guns of Red Tails who had refused to break away. The skies erupted in dogfights so intense that radio chatter nearly dissolved into chaos. Yet amid the confusion, a bomber pilot's voice broke through. "We got the Red Tails with us. We'll make it home today." That confidence was new. Bomber crews, many of whom had endured staggering losses, now begged command to assign the Tuskegee Airmen as escorts. For the Red Tails, that respect was both vindication and responsibility. They were no longer just fighting for recognition within their own army. They were guardians of lives, wing after wing of young men who trusted them with every mile toward Berlin. But trust did not come without sacrifice. The Luftwaffe, recognizing the Red Tails' growing reputation, began prioritizing them in combat. German pilots whispered grudging respect for the Black Flyers, while commanders labeled them a threat that needed to be neutralized. Dogfights grew deadlier. Missions stretched longer. Every victory came at a cost. In one clash over southern Germany, a squadron of red tails intercepted enemy fighters before they could reach a bomber stream. Outnumbered nearly 3-1, the Tuskegee pilots didn't back down. They maneuvered with precision, splitting enemy formations, forcing them into fragmented duels. One pilot, after scoring 2 kills, found himself surrounded with dwindling fuel. Instead of fleeing, he dove through the melee, drawing enemy fire away from the bombers, until his Mustang could no longer hold altitude. He bailed out, captured behind enemy lines. His actions saved dozens, perhaps hundreds, but his name never made newspaper headlines back home. Stories like his defined the red tails. They weren't measured solely by confirmed kills or medals, though they racked up plenty. Their legacy was measured in the sheer number of bombers that returned home intact because they refused to abandon them. And while other groups sometimes boasted higher personal tallies, no unit carried such a stark balance between sacrifice and success. By 1944, whispers of the red tails spread not only through Allied ranks but also across German radio intercepts. The once dismissive Luftwaffe commanders now instructed their aces to expect colored fighter escorts. This acknowledgement, though backhanded, confirmed what American newspapers rarely did. The red tails had become a nightmare for German air superiority. Still, respect did not shield them from the cruel irony of their position. In Europe's skies, they were indispensable. Back home, they were second-class citizens. Letters from families reminded them of segregated restaurants, buses, and schools waiting for them after the war. Many wrestled with a gnawing thought. How could a country demand their lives in the skies of Germany while denying their dignity on the streets of Alabama or Ohio? Yet those contradictions hardened their resolve. If every mission brought them closer to proving their worth, then every bullet fired in combat carried double meaning. For the Red Tails, defeating the Luftwaffe was not just about winning the war. It was about carving an undeniable record that no one could erase. The proof lay in statistics the Germans themselves couldn't ignore. Bomber groups escorted by the Tuskegee Airmen consistently recorded fewer losses compared to groups escorted by others. Where Luftwaffe raids had once torn entire formations to shreds, survival rates climbed whenever red-tailed Mustangs appeared on the horizon. And with every safe return, bomber crews spread the word, "Get us the red tails." The Luftwaffe's growing desperation revealed itself in new tactics. German pilots attempted ambushes, luring the escorts away with feigned retreats while other fighters pounced on the bombers. But the Tuskegee Airmen refused to be baited. Their discipline, often criticized by rival squadrons who accused them of chasing too few kills, was their strength. Protect the bombers first, engage only when necessary. That unwavering focus broke German strategies again and again. One mission in the spring of 1945 showcased this philosophy. As Allied bombers targeted the industrial heart of Berlin, the Luftwaffe launched one of its fiercest responses. Swarms of jet-powered Me-262s streaked toward the formations, their speed unlike anything propeller-driven fighters had faced before. While many Allied squadrons struggled to counter this new threat, the Red Tails adapted on the spot. Instead of chasing the jets outright, they anticipated attack patterns, positioning themselves to strike as the 262 slowed during vulnerable landing or attack runs. That day, Tuskegee pilots not only shielded their bombers but scored kills against Germany's cutting-edge technology, proving that even jet-age advances couldn't overshadow discipline and resolve. Each mission deepened their legend. Each German kill chipped away at an enemy that had once dismissed them outright. And as the war neared its climax, the Red Tails' presence in the sky symbolized not only Allied dominance but also a future that, for the men inside those cockpits, still felt painfully uncertain. When victory in Europe finally arrived, the Red Tails' record spoke louder than any propaganda. Over 15,000 sorties flown, hundreds of enemy aircraft destroyed, countless bomber crews escorted to safety. A unit once doubted, mocked, and segregated had written its story across Europe's skies in the smoke of burning Messerschmitts and the contrails of returning bombers. But their war wasn't truly over. For while Germany had fallen, the battle awaiting them back in the United States would test them in ways the Luftwaffe never could. When the guns finally fell silent in Europe, the Red Tails had earned a reputation that not even the most skeptical Allied officer could dismiss. Their record, over 15,000 sorties, hundreds of enemy fighters destroyed, and bomber loss rates that put other escort groups to shame, was undeniable. Yet, as their Mustangs returned to Allied airfields in Italy one last time, a sobering reality weighed on the men who climbed down from those cockpits. The war against the Luftwaffe had been won. The war at home was another matter. For many Tuskegee Airmen, the return journey across the Atlantic was more jarring than any mission over Germany. In Europe, bomber crews saluted them, commanders praised them, and even enemy pilots grudgingly respected them. Back in the United States, the same men who had faced Messerschmitts at 20,000 feet were forced to ride in the back of buses or drink from colored-only fountains. Their uniforms, their medals, their service, none of it shielded them from the same prejudice they had left behind. The contradiction cut deep. Some of them had dreamed that valor in war would open doors in peace. Instead, they found themselves once again fighting for recognition, this time not against the Luftwaffe but against laws and customs that seemed as immovable as mountains. But unlike before the war, they now carried proof. They had numbers, they had records, and they had the respect of thousands of bomber crews who owed their lives to those red-tailed fighters in the sky. Their story began to ripple beyond military circles. Newspapers cautiously reported on their achievements. African American communities celebrated them as heroes, holding parades where they were lifted on shoulders and showered with gratitude. For young boys and girls who had never seen someone like them wear pilot wings, the red tails became living proof that the sky was no longer closed to their dreams. Inside the ranks of the Air Force, however, the old resistance lingered. Promotions were slow, opportunities still limited, and whispers of doubt never fully vanished. But something had changed. The war had exposed the absurdity of segregation in the armed forces. How could a country demand sacrifice from men it refused to treat as equals? The question grew louder, impossible to ignore. By 1948, just 3 years after victory in Europe, President Harry Truman signed Executive Order 9981, desegregating the U.S. military. Historians would later point out that the Tuskegee Airmen's record had been a decisive factor in that bold move. Their performance stripped away every excuse segregationists had clung to. They had fought, they had won, and they had saved countless lives. To deny them equality after that was to deny reality itself. Yet, even as their military legacy became cemented, the Tuskegee Airmen remained careful to remind anyone listening. Theirs was not just a tale of triumph, but also of struggle. Many never lived to see the recognition that would eventually come. Some died over Europe, buried in fields far from home. Others returned only to fade into civilian life, their wartime stories forgotten for decades until historians and filmmakers revived them. Still, for those who carried the memory firsthand, the legend of the Red Tails never dulled. Bomber crews who once looked through the smoke of flak and saw crimson-painted stabilizers beside them would recall it as a sight that meant survival. German pilots, even in memoirs written years after the war, confessed to the shock of facing opponents they had once dismissed out of hand. And within African American communities, the Red Tails became a symbol that courage, skill, and unity could break barriers higher than any enemy altitude. The narrative of their 100 kills against seasoned Luftwaffe pilots grew into more than a statistic. It became a statement that no prejudice, no dismissal, no systemic barrier could erase excellence when it was flown into the skies. Each confirmed victory wasn't only about the downed aircraft. It was a piece of history clawed back from the grip of doubt. Their red-painted tails, once just a practical unit marker, became an icon in themselves. To bomber crews, it was a sign of safety. To the enemy, it was a warning. To history, it became a symbol of defiance, bright against the gray canvas of war. That flash of crimson against cloud and contrail told a story in silence, one understood by anyone who had ever fought to be seen. Even decades later, reunions of the Tuskegee Airmen carried the same fire. Old men in crisp jackets and medals would retell their days over Italy, Germany, and Austria, their voices steady, their eyes far away. They laughed about pranks pulled in the barracks. They mourned friends who never came home, and they marveled at how far their story had traveled. Children leaned in, wide-eyed, while reporters scribbled notes, realizing they were in the presence of men who had rewritten both military history and the broader narrative of a nation. Hollywood eventually caught on. Documentaries, books, and films pushed their legacy into popular culture, giving them the stage they had long deserved. Yet, for the airmen themselves, the true reward was never the spotlight. It was the knowledge that they had done their duty at the highest level, even when the deck had been stacked against them. The irony is sharp. German aces once laughed at the idea of black flyers daring to challenge them. They dismissed the Red Tails as a non-threat, an experiment doomed to fail. Instead, those same pilots saw their names added to kill tallies that climbed past 100. Each duel in the clouds silenced another sneer, each victory another rebuttal to prejudice delivered at gunpoint, engine roaring, propeller spinning. Their legacy lingers not in monuments alone, but in every pilot of color who straps into a cockpit today. The Tuskegee Airmen proved that courage knows no color, that discipline wins wars, and that dignity, once earned, cannot be denied forever. They turned the skies of Europe into a battlefield not only for freedom abroad but for equality at home. And so, when we remember the story of the Red Tails, the men who racked up kills against Germany's finest, the men who shielded bombers through storms of flak and steel, we are not just remembering combat victories. We are remembering a generation that refused to accept limits, that carried the fight for recognition into enemy skies, and that came back home to demand the justice they had already earned in blood. Their story ends where it began, with doubt. But this time, the doubt does not belong to the airmen. It belongs to anyone who still wonders if they were capable, if they were worthy, if they belonged. History has already answered. The Red Tails belonged not only in the air but in the highest chapters of courage ever written. And though the Luftwaffe once dismissed them, the records, etched in the statistics of saved bombers, enemy kills, and enduring respect, tell a truth that no denial can erase. The Red Tails did not just fly. They redefined what flight meant.